Tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannons, live rounds fired. That was my leisurely Sunday afternoon in Hong Kong. Why are the protesters out on the streets? They have 5 demands. 1. The full withdrawal of a bill that would allow suspects in Hong Kong to be extradited to China. 2. An inquiry into allegations of police brutality. 3. Amnesty for the arrested protesters. 4. Universal suffrage to allow 100% of the city's executive council, which is dominated by Beijing, to be voted in by the people of Hong Kong. The 5th demand is that authorities stop referring to the demonstrations as riots, which is probably going to be difficult given that you basically have 2 armies dressed in battle gear, gas masks and armed with weapons, one side lobbing tear gas, the other side lobbing bricks. It certainly looked like a riot to me. The Hong Kong government has said over and over again that it won't accept any of the 5 demands, so the violence will only escalate. Many protesters have also said they think violence is part of protest and that the threat to their freedoms is so existential they need to resort to all means possible. We talked to several people who said that the Chinese government is using mass migration to subsume Hong Kong's identity and weaken its unity. Does that remind you of anything?
Ich auch. Ist doch hübsch. Enjoy difference, start tolerance.
Chinese people are allowed to move to Hong Kong and get immediate access to the jobs market, housing and healthcare benefits. They're even allowed to vote. This destabilization and subversion of Hong Kong is driving a great deal of the resentment. And it goes both ways. Dozens of Chinese taxi drivers in Hong Kong are flying huge Chinese flags from the back of their cars. There have also been small, sporadic pro-China protests in the city, but they're minuscule in comparison to the anti-Beijing protests. Despite dressing similar, the Hong Kong protesters are very different from America's snarling, spitting, obnoxious Antifa thugs. Whereas Antifa attacks the media and refuses to be filmed, the Hong Kong protesters go out of their way to protect the media and prevent journalists from being harmed. Whereas Antifa burns the American flag, the Hong Kong protesters fly it proudly. They've also taken a shining to Pepe the Frog, proving once again that any meme can be reclaimed and repurposed despite the American media's obsession with denouncing it as a hate symbol. And no, that doesn't mean the protesters are far right, as numerous idiotic, tanky left-wing journalists are claiming. Opposing an authoritarian regime that silences dissent by literally flattening people doesn't make you far right. It just makes you right. No reasonable person could deny that the protesters' grievances and fears are entirely authentic. This isn't a bunch of whiny, privileged leftists protesting for rights they already have, just so they can virtue signal about waving a woke banner on social media. This is a nation's youth fighting for the preservation of its future. They're going up against one of the most fearsome military regimes on the planet, a nuclear-armed dictatorship that interns millions of members of minority groups in re-education camps. They're risking incarceration, torture, and a nightmare future trapped in China's social credit score system. A Minority Report-style dystopia where dissidents who express the wrong political opinions are prevented from using social media, traveling, or even having bank accounts. Again, remind you of anything?
Dear passengers, people who travel without tickets or behave disorderly or smoking public areas will be punished according to regulations, and the behavior will be recorded in the individual credit information system.
The anti-surveillance aspect of the demonstrations came to the fore when protesters tore down so-called smart lamps which they fear are secretly scanning their faces. To give you an idea of how intense China's control over propaganda and information really is, a local Catholic priest who didn't want to be named for fear of repercussions said that religious education in China is so tightly controlled that many people have never even heard of Jesus Christ. The Christian community in Hong Kong is standing firmly behind the protesters. On Friday night, there was a vigil attended by thousands of participants. Sing hallelujah, sing hallelujah. This preceded the monumental human chain, where protesters linked arms for 30 miles around the entire city. They even climbed up mountains. The event was an homage to the Baltic Way, when 2 million people joined hands around 3 countries, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, in 1989 to protest against the tyranny of Soviet rule. Which reminds us that the Hong Kong protest is fundamentally anti-communist. Chai Nazi graffiti also adorns walls across the city. The wider Hong Kong population broadly supports the protesters, which is no surprise given that police have fired tear gas inside shopping malls, subways and densely populated residential areas, leading in some situations to angry residents banding together and forcing the cops to leave. Who's responsible for the violence? Police claim they're merely defending themselves against armed mobs and trying to maintain order. But protesters say the demonstrations were peaceful up until riot cops were deployed and tear gas was used against them. China has thousands of troops massing in nearby Shenzhen. Will they be sent into Hong Kong to enact a brutal, bloody crackdown? Probably not, experts say, but Chinese culture is all about avoiding embarrassment, saving face. If Hong Kong is still in turmoil, on October 1st, the 70th anniversary of the founding of Communist China, that will be the biggest embarrassment imaginable for Beijing. So they have to do something. And this is China we're talking about. Tiananmen Square was only 30 years ago. What that something will be remains to be seen. But it certainly isn't going to be pretty. It's absolutely crucial for you to help me fight the war on free speech by supporting me via Subscribe Star, link in description, and also signing up for my free newsletter at summit.news/newsletter.